The first time they saw her rolling rocks up the bluff, a full week before the town had even finished framing its newest church, they didn't just laugh, they took bets on how long she'd last before giving up. Not just because she was a widow, not just because she was building alone, but because she wasn't doing what a sensible woman would have done with her husband's land. She was building on stone, and no one in Deadwood Hollow built on stone. Not when the good, soft dirt below was easier, faster, cheaper to cut. But Josephine Mercer didn't care about faster, or cheaper, or what they said when she passed the feed store with bruises on her arms from hauling granite blocks up out of the ravine. She was chasing something older than pride, something colder than grief, something that wouldn't budge when the storms came howling down from the mountains, snapping every beam of pine the men had nailed with haste and prayer. And the storms were coming. It had only been 5 months since Thomas Mercer was buried without ceremony in the hard frost behind the chapel, his grave marked by nothing more than a cairn of river stones and the tiny broken cross their son carved. Josephine hadn't wept when they covered the body. She'd just turned her face east toward the rocks, like she already saw something there that no one else did. "You can't anchor a house on that," old Garrett had spat in the saloon. "That foundation's gonna crack the first time the earth shifts. It's solid now, sure, but rock breathes. It buckles. It's a fool's base." "She's grieving," one of the farmers offered, almost kindly. "Can't blame her for building something dumb. Grief don't let you think straight." But Josephine wasn't grieving like they thought. She was calculating. They didn't see her at night, when the wind screamed through Deadwood like wolves in the dark, carrying off porch shutters and sleep. But she was out there, even then, with a scarf tied around her face and blood freezing in her boots. She set stones one by one, tapping the frost off them with a hammer until her fingers blistered. No plans, no blueprints, just instinct. The kind passed down, not on paper but in scars and stories from women who had buried men and kept children alive long enough to see another harvest. Her cabin didn't rise in days, like the others. It grew slowly, like something clawing its way out of the earth. By spring, the stone foundation stood chest high, strange and ugly, and defiant against the prairie wind. It wasn't pretty. It didn't look like the other cabins with their trimmed white frames and porches made for sitting. But it didn't shift. It didn't crack. And when the rains hit that April, the water didn't creep in through the floorboards, because there were no floorboards yet, just a fortress of cold rock. The town didn't let her forget it. They smiled at her in church. They offered help they didn't mean. They called her brave in that pitying tone men used when a woman refused to fold. "She's trying to build a castle," one boy said. "Like in those books. Widow thinks she's a queen now. She'll come down off that bluff before winter. Just wait." But she didn't. Instead, she started hauling lumber, not pine, not the flimsy lengths the men cut fast to stretch their coins. She paid double for red oak from the mill 2 counties south, thick planks no saw in town could have cut clean. She paid in silver, old silver, coins no one had seen in years. "How the hell's she affording that?" growled one rancher, spitting chew into the dirt behind the general store. But Josephine said nothing. She just kept building. The frame went up in June, a low, broad-beamed thing sunk into her stone cradle like a ship into a dry dock. She didn't build high. No attic, no second floor, just a long rectangle with deep eaves and a single thick chimney. And beneath it all, the foundation swallowed the first floor whole, sinking 2 feet deeper than any other home in Deadwood. Some whispered she was building a bunker. Others joked she was hiding gold in the stone. A few muttered darker things, that maybe she was digging down to escape, or that she'd finally gone mad and would vanish into that hole before winter came. But the truth was worse. Josephine was preparing for a storm the rest of them refused to believe in. She'd watched what the spring floods did to the Bronson place, swept the floor right off the beams and left the cabin cracked open like a walnut. She saw what the wind did to the Turner barn. Splinters lodged in trees, roofs gone overnight. She'd heard the way the soil shifted under the Anders cabin after just one thaw, the whole structure tilting like a drunk, and she'd counted every mistake. That was her secret. She was watching. She was always watching. No one knew she'd spent 3 years reading carpentry books by candlelight while Thomas worked the trap lines, or that she'd written to her uncle in Kentucky for advice on frost lines, and spent weeks sketching structural drawings with charcoal on flour sacks. No one asked. They didn't want her to be clever. They wanted her broken, or at least humble. But Josephine Mercer had never been either. By late July, the foundation was finished, sealed with lime mortar and waterproofed with pine tar she'd rendered herself. The cabin stood atop it like a fortress disguised as a home. The windows were narrow, the shutters thick. The roof was low but weighted, lashed with iron straps and anchored into the very rock beneath the frost line. Some called it overkill, others called it madness. But when the first storm hit in September, early, angry, and howling like the Lord's own breath, the Mercer's cabin didn't flinch. While shingles flew from town like birds caught in a blast, and the mill roof cracked, and 3 barns lost their doors, Josephine's cabin didn't even groan, not once. The next morning they found her sitting on the stone steps, sipping broth from a tin cup, as smoke curled lazy from her chimney. She didn't smile, she didn't have to, but the storm was just the beginning, because what came that winter made men beg for the days when the wind only rattled the windows, and Josephine Mercer's stone foundation would prove to be the only thing standing between life and death. For more than just her, the cold came so hard that November it cracked the pond in half before dawn. One day the ice had been slick and soft enough for boys to skate by noon. The next it was jagged like broken glass, rising at the edges where the wind had bent it mid-freeze. The dogs stopped barking at night. Chickens froze upright in their coops. Water buckets snapped like clay pots if left on the porch for more than an hour. That was the winter they stopped laughing at Josephine Mercer, but they didn't admit it yet. Not out loud, not even when Edna Crawford's cabin, barely a year old, split down the center like a rotting peach. Not when the woodpile behind the Granger place caught fire from a stovepipe spark, and the blaze took both roof and rafters before anyone could dig a firebreak. Not even when old Sheriff Burns was found frozen stiff on his porch steps, the key still hanging from his fingers, the door just slightly ajar behind him. Deadwood Hollow was full of stubborn men, and Josephine was a memory they couldn't quite reconcile with the woman now lighting her chimney at dusk, the orange glow flickering over stone walls that refused to groan or bow or shift, no matter how the wind bit and clawed at every edge. Inside that cabin, it was warm, not just tolerable, warm, because Josephine hadn't just built thick, she'd built smart. The floor was sunk 4 feet into the foundation, with stone-lined walls forming a thermal basin, slow to freeze, slower to thaw. She'd layered the walls with wool and clay, sealed every seam with tar and old flour paste, and banked the back of the house against a hill so the snow would bury her instead of batter her. And she never used more than 1 log at a time in the stove. The heat didn't need help, it stayed. She didn't gloat, didn't walk into town and hold her warmth like a trophy. But people noticed. They always do when they're cold, especially when their children start coughing. By the first week of December, the snow had buried the outhouses. Men were chopping doors out of the upper levels of barns just to get outside. One family tried to ride out the cold in the smokehouse, another in the root cellar. Neither made it 2 days before smoke turned to poison, and the frost crept up the walls like white mold. One night, 3 children showed up at Josephine's door, barefoot. One boy's hands were so blue he couldn't knock. His sister used her body like a hammer, slamming her shoulder until the latch jostled. Josephine opened it. Without a word, she took them in, sat them by the stove and fed them broth so slowly their teeth chattered between sips. By morning their parents had been found dead, huddled together in a dugout barely big enough for a root basket. She didn't ask questions, she didn't send the children back. She gave them blankets and a corner of the room to sleep in, and when one of them woke crying in the dark, she laid a hand on his forehead and whispered nothing at all. That's when word started to spread, not over the bar or through the church, but between mothers, between the ones who didn't care if their husbands grumbled or their neighbors gossiped. She has a stove, she has heat, she has space, she has stone. On the second Saturday of December, Ruth Anders came up the bluff with a basket of dried beans and 2 sick babies. No coat, no boots, just desperation. She didn't knock either. Josephine opened the door before she could, didn't ask why, didn't blink at the children, just took the basket, helped Ruth inside, and bolted the door behind them. She made them stay near the stove for 3 hours before she let the children sleep, and when Ruth tried to weep into her hands, Josephine took them away, wrapped them in a wool scarf and said, "Your tears'll freeze before they matter. Save your strength." Ruth nodded. They didn't speak again for 2 days. By mid-December, Josephine's cabin held 13 people, 2 widowers, 4 children, a teenager from the logging camp who'd fallen through ice and hadn't stopped shivering for days, a schoolteacher with burns on both palms from a cracked stove, a boy with no family and an empty bag of jerky. And Josephine fed them all, not just with food, with silence, with calm, with a heat that didn't vanish the moment the fire died down. They slept against the stone walls wrapped in wool, their breath fogging faintly above them, but not freezing, not inside her home. The town, meanwhile, was starving, not for lack of food. They had stores, but most of it was buried behind walls warped with ice. Even dry goods grew damp when the wind seeped through board seams. Salt pork turned grey. Biscuits crumbled. Water froze into the shape of the pot and shattered it from within. And wood was running out. They started coming at night, not in groups, alone, quietly. Men who'd once laughed loudest, women who'd once warned their children to stay away from the mad widow. Now they came with blankets, jars of preserves, frozen loaves of bread. They didn't ask for charity. They asked for hours. Just a few hours by her stove. Just enough to stop their toes from turning black. Just enough to let the baby sleep without wheezing. And Josephine, ever the fool, ever the stubborn widow, let them. Not all, not at once, but a few. Then a few more. The stove never dimmed, the stone never cracked. Her walls, her pride, held fast against the weight of all that need. One night, a man named Keller, who'd once called her a feral crow nesting in rocks, knocked with blood on his knuckles and frost crusted in his beard. Josephine looked at him through the crack in the door and said, "You'll have to leave the rifle outside." He nodded. He dropped it in the snow like a dead branch. She opened the door, let him in, fed him stew, and he wept, not out of shame, but because he hadn't felt warm since October. That's when the town changed. Not all at once, not by consensus, but like a herd finally turning toward the scent of water. One by one, they started to understand that this wasn't just luck, or stubbornness, or some divine act of survival. It was stone, and the woman who knew how to use it. In January the storm came, the one they still whisper about when the snow hits early. It buried the west pasture fence lines. It tore the church steeple clean off. It killed 7 head of cattle without so much as a noise in the night, and it lasted 3 days. By the end of the first, every other cabin had gone black. By the second, the smoke stopped rising from every chimney but Josephine's. By the third, half the town was inside her home. Some collapsed in the doorway. Others came before dawn, leaving behind fires they couldn't keep fed. All of them found room. Somehow, she moved the furniture, rolled up every rug, let people sleep on the stone floor, packed tight and quiet. Children lined the hearth. Old men leaned against the inner walls, their cheeks pink again for the first time in weeks. Someone whispered, "It's like a cave." Another answered, "It's like a temple." Josephine heard neither. She was on her knees in the back, adding another log to the stove. Just one, just enough. The next morning, the snow stopped, and silence fell heavy on the town. Josephine stepped outside with a shovel and her boots half frozen. She dug a path wide enough for breath. The others watched from the doorway, waiting. When she stood upright, the wind dead around her, she turned to face them and said only, "This'll pass." And somehow, they believed her. In the weeks that followed, no one left the stone cabin without kneeling first. They didn't mean to. It wasn't some vow or pact or holy ritual. It was just what happened naturally when they stepped out onto the stone steps and felt the cold snap at their knees again, reminding them how it could kill a man in minutes, how close they'd come to vanishing, and how the woman behind them, quiet, grim-faced, sleeves rolled, hands cracked and bruised from stovework and shovel, had kept them breathing through a storm that had broken the rest of the town like sticks. No one said the word miracle. Josephine wouldn't have stood for it. It wasn't a miracle. It was mortar and rock and iron nails that hadn't bent. It was foresight, preparation, sacrifice, a shovel that never left her side, boots with the soles patched 10 times over, fingers numb to the wrist. It was everything they'd mocked when the sun still shone in August, and every man fancied himself a builder because he'd seen his father put a roof on a shed. She'd done it alone, and now they followed her. The days were short now, not because the sun set earlier, that was expected, but because time stretched differently when everyone moved slower. Bodies weakened by cold didn't mend fast. The young boy who'd come barefoot still couldn't feel 3 of his toes. The schoolteacher barely had the strength to rise from her blankets some mornings. Lungs damaged from that first icy night when the chimney collapsed in her classroom. And yet Josephine rose at the same time each day, before the sky even shifted blue, and opened the cabin door just long enough to let the frost bite her face and confirm what she already knew. They weren't through it. Not yet. The town was different now. Smaller, quieter. Every home that hadn't been built with care stood abandoned or charred or buckled beneath snowdrifts like collapsed paper dolls. The church had no roof. The schoolhouse had no door. The Crawford barn had disappeared entirely, taken by wind, they said, like it had never been there at all. From Josephine's cabin, you could see it all. Her bluff stood above the bend in the creek, now frozen to stone, and the bare fields beyond. It was the highest point on the southern edge of Deadwood Hollow, just high enough to spot every chimney that should have been smoking, every home that should have still been whole. Only 3 cabins still stood with their frames intact. The Mercers, the Bronson cabin, barely, its roof bowed like a warped dish, and the Anders' old dugout, propped up now with timbers scavenged from wrecked wagons. But even those 2 had started sending people up the bluff. They didn't ask anymore. They just came. It was the widow's house now. They stopped calling it hers like it was some shameful claim, some madness she'd stubbornly clung to in grief. It was the town's, but not by deed, by need. She didn't own them, and they didn't serve her, but they followed her hands, every one of them, from child to carpenter, as if some wordless vote had been cast in the firelight when the wind screamed and the stone stayed still. She had become the anchor, the center, and she never asked to be. One night, as January bowed into February, a knock came that none of them expected. A full horse team approached, breath steaming, hooves crunching through snow so thick the sound was muffled. The riders were wrapped in long coats, guns at their sides, faces hidden under scarves. The horses wore bells, muted by the cold. Josephine stood at the door, lamp in hand, and waited as the first rider dismounted. A tall man, clean boots, gloves without holes, federal, maybe surveyors, maybe rail scouts, maybe worse. "You Josephine Mercer?" he asked. She didn't answer. "You own the stone cabin on the hill?" Still, she said nothing, just let the silence stretch until the man shifted, uncomfortable. "We were told you might be taking in strays, starving folks, sick ones." "I'm not a hotel," she said. "We're not guests." One of the children had crept to her side, peering around the doorframe, a finger in his mouth. The man looked down, softened just slightly. "Ma'am, we've got word of sickness, death, maybe plague." "There's no plague here. You have 20 people under your roof." 19. "Doesn't matter. It's not permitted. You're required to report illness and casualties to the township doctor." "There is no doctor," Josephine said. "He left in December. His roof came down on the second storm. Broke his back. He sent a letter east, then died in the Bronsons' barn." The man's jaw flexed. "Regardless," he said, trying to find the official tone again. "This is a potential sanitation crisis. We've been ordered to take census and assess risk. There may be evacuation." Josephine just stared. "There's nothing left to evacuate to," she said. He stepped forward then, not threatening, just tired. He looked behind her into the cabin, where the stove glowed like an altar and people lay on the floor wrapped in wool and rags. "You built this yourself?" "Yes." "With rock?" "Yes." He was quiet. One of his men climbed down from the saddle and walked around the side of the cabin, tapping the stone, inspecting the mortar. "Well, it's the only thing standing for 5 miles, the man finally said. "We lost 2 wagons trying to reach the Anders place. Snow swallowed the trail. But this is something else." He wasn't mocking her, not anymore. Josephine nodded once. "It's warm." He rubbed his jaw. "It's more than warm." Then he said, "I've got 3 wounded and a mother with fever in the sled. Can they come in?" That night, the federal men stayed in the barn behind the cabin. The wounded came inside. The mother and her child were laid near the stove, fed broth, and covered with the last good quilts. Josephine barely slept, but she didn't close her eyes out of fear. She watched the door, because she knew how quickly men turned, and she wouldn't let anyone take what she'd built. By March, the frost finally broke, not all at once. But there was a day when the icicles on the eaves began to melt in steady rhythm, the first drops falling like tiny gunshots against the stones below. A day when birds returned to the sky in 2s and 3s, wheeling awkwardly in the pale blue, as if unsure they'd survived the same storm the ground still wore. That week, the first child stepped outside barefoot. He wept from the sting of cold on thawing flesh, but he laughed too because it didn't cut deep anymore. He could feel the dirt again, and with spring came the reckoning. Deadwood Hollow had lost 19 structures, 3 families gone, entirely, no trace but names in a school ledger. The church was gone, the schoolhouse gutted, the general store rotted through and collapsed. But the stone cabin on the hill stood whole. The men who once mocked it brought timber. The women who once whispered of madness brought seeds and soap. Children drew it in charcoal on the last scraps of paper they could find. Big rectangles with smoke curling from square chimneys, walls black and thick like fortress ramparts. And they didn't call it the Mercer place anymore. They called it the Foundation. That summer they rebuilt differently. Not one cabin without stone under its feet, not one home raised without wider eaves, thicker walls, deeper floors. They asked Josephine to draw plans. She didn't, but she stood at the center of every raising, watching, nodding, pointing when a beam needed shifting, when a joint needed shaving. She never raised her voice, but when she spoke, men listened, and when the next winter came, milder, kinder, but still sharp as a knife's edge, every house held fast. But only one had never fallen, only one had never buckled, only one had held the town together by heat and stone, and will alone. Josephine Mercer never remarried. She never left the cabin. She planted a small garden by the southern wall, where the stone kept the soil warmer longer. She raised chickens again and goats, and sometimes when the wind shifted just right, she'd sit on the stone step where the townsfolk used to kneel, sip her broth, and watch the smoke curl up into the sky. She didn't smile. She didn't need to. The town remembered, and the stone remembered for them. It was 2 years before they stopped calling her the widow, not because they forgot what she'd lost, but because they finally saw her for what she'd become. She was still Josephine Mercer, but she was no longer anyone's shadow, not someone's wife, not someone's pity, not even a curiosity or a cautionary tale. She was the one who stayed standing, the one whose name children now spoke when drawing pictures of strength, the one every house builder sought out before breaking ground, because even the cockiest men who'd once chuckled over whiskey about her fancy rock porch had learned what a winter could do, and Deadwood Hollow never forgot that first winter, the one that carved the truth into bone, the year that proved a foundation wasn't a choice, it was survival. By the third summer, the town had changed. The new schoolhouse stood on a low stone base 3 feet deep, its walls sealed with pitch, and its roof braced with iron. The church, too, rebuilt with thicker beams and a bell tower low and squat, hugging the wind instead of tempting it. Every new home had some stone beneath it, even if just a line of rocks tamped into the frost line and sealed with clay mortar. No one built fast anymore. No one built cheap. The traders who passed through noticed it too. They saw the cabins, solid and squat like blockhouses, the people, leaner and quieter, and they saw the stone house on the rise, unchanged, still stronger than the rest. Travelers asked who lived there, and the townsfolk would smile without speaking, nod toward the hill, and say only, "You'll see." Children played near the Mercer place now, not because Josephine encouraged it, but because no mother feared it anymore. They wandered up the hill with baskets and trundled back with rocks and stories. "She's building something new," one girl whispered. "Where?" another asked. "In the back, where the chickens used to be." "What is it?" She didn't say, but Josephine was always building, even when her hands were tired, even when her knees ached, and the firewood stack shrank faster than she could replace it. She built not for comfort, not even for warmth, but because stone was a language, and she still had more to say. One afternoon, Ruth Anders came up the hill again, older now, with her hair tied in a ribbon, and her sons, once sickly, now taller than her shoulder, trailing behind. Ruth stood by the edge of the path, hesitating. Josephine looked up from her mortar pan and waited. "I brought eggs," Ruth said. "I've got hens." "These are better," Ruth answered. Josephine nodded, but made no move to take them. Ruth stepped closer. "I came to ask about the girls," she said. "They're nearly of age. We're thinking of building a home near the old river bend." Josephine set her trowel down, wiped her hands. "You'll need to dig 3 feet down," she said. "Even if the soil's soft, lay stone flat, no gaps. Use ash for the mortar base, not just lime. Ash holds better in wet cold." Ruth nodded, already scribbling in her mind. "And don't forget the slope," Josephine added. "The hill above the bend shifts in thaw. It'll press into the back wall if you don't angle it." "Thank you," Ruth said softly. "It means a lot, coming from you." Josephine didn't answer. She just picked up her trowel and got back to work. Ruth left the eggs anyway. It became a kind of ritual over the years. People came to her cabin not for warmth, not anymore, but for knowledge, for stories told in the weight of granite and the slope of a rafter. They brought cheese, bread, smoked fish, wild herbs, old boots and questions. They left with sketches and measurements, whispered warnings, and a deep respect they didn't always know how to name. Not every building could afford stone, but no one dared build on sand again, and Josephine never stopped teaching, though she'd have denied doing anything of the sort. The boy who'd come to her door barefoot during that first storm, Samuel they now called him, grew into a wiry, broad-shouldered teen with a gift for axes and a head full of numbers. He wasn't hers, not by blood, but he stayed after the others had gone back to their families. He stayed when spring came, when summer harvests returned, when the cabins below no longer needed her warmth. He stayed because he'd felt something deep in his bones that first night beside the stone hearth, something permanent. When he turned 16, he asked to build. "A shop," he said, "for tools, repairs, maybe a forge." Josephine watched him for a moment before answering. "You know what that takes? Heat, ventilation, drainage, stone set deeper than frostline, roof pitched against the south wind." "That all?" he smirked. "And patience. You taught me that." She gave him a nod. "You'll do it beside the bluff. The stone'll hold your back wall steady, but you're not using my foundation. You'll dig your own." He grinned, and he did. That year, Samuel's forge was the only place in the county that didn't leak smoke in the rain, and his anvil rang straight and true, because Josephine stood by each course of stone, each post hole, each beam, not correcting, not taking over, just watching, just being present, the way a mountain is present when wind tests its edges. It was the last build she oversaw personally. Her hands weren't what they used to be. The winters, even the milder ones, had begun to settle into her joints like tiny wolves, gnawing from within. Some mornings she had to heat stones just to get her fingers to close, but she never complained, never mentioned the pain. She didn't stop splitting wood until the axe slipped from her grip one day, and Samuel caught it before it hit her foot. "You'll let me do that now," he said, and she did. That was all. No argument, no pride. She passed him the gloves and walked back inside. Time did what time always does. Children grew, Families moved on. The town turned over twice. Old faces buried beneath new wooden crosses, younger ones building over the memories. Roads came, a telegraph, a railroad camp a few miles east, new names, new shops, fewer cabins, more brick. But no matter how much changed, the stone cabin remained, and they still came, every spring. As the frost bled back into the creek and the hills breathed green again, there'd be a knock. Not a knock of desperation anymore, but of reverence. A young couple with plans, a carpenter's apprentice, a rancher seeking advice on drainage, a widow with 3 daughters, and a patch of land that flooded every March. And Josephine, now white-haired and slower in her steps, would meet them with silence. Let them explain. Let them talk themselves breathless. Then offer a nod or a warning or a story. Don't trust the hill. Even friendly slopes will shift. Wind doesn't care how pretty your trim is. Stone remembers. Make sure you lay it like you want to be remembered. In her 71st year, she took ill. Not sudden, not violent. Just slow, like ice forming beneath skin. Her hands stopped gripping. Her knees no longer bent without fire first. She stayed in bed more. Let Samuel tend the stove. He had his own home by then, a proper one, solid, with children of his own. But he came, each morning, sat by her bed, read aloud, or just listened to the wind. "You'll need to reinforce the south wall next year," she murmured once, barely audible. He nodded, tears caught behind his eyes. "I know. And don't let 'em build shallow, not even if it's warm that spring. Weather lies, I promise. And if the new schoolhouse leaks, don't patch it. Tear it down. Build proper." "Yes, Mum." She looked at him then, a rare flicker of amusement softening her brow. "You always were the only one who listened." She passed in late autumn, just as the frost returned. No fanfare, no crowd, just the sound of wind tapping lightly at the window, and Samuel's voice reading from the ledger where she'd written down her notes in charcoal, years and years ago. He buried her beneath the cabin. Not in front, not beside, beneath. He dug through the stone himself, down into the mortar and gravel, into the very heart of the foundation, set her in a wooden box lined with wool, sealed tight, and filled the earth back slow. People came, not to mourn, but to thank her. Some left stones, others left drawings. One child left a single worn boot, the kind Josephine once hung to dry above the stove. The cabin stands still. Weathered, yes, moss on the northern wall, chimney re-bricked once. But the stone, unmoved, undisturbed, as if the world turns around it, not through it. And though the town has changed, paved roads now, telephones, even a small school with electric light, they still point toward the hill when asked about the town's start. "See that stone house?" they say. "That's where Deadwood Hollow learned to last." Years pass in a place like Deadwood Hollow without announcement. Trees lean a little further each winter. Children born in storms become men in quiet seasons. Stones crack a little deeper, but they do not fall, not if laid right, not if laid by hands that knew what a foundation was supposed to be. The old maps don't show the cabin anymore. New roads rerouted the town's path half a mile south when the railway came in. But the people still walk the bluff when it's time to remember something that mattered. Not because they need directions, because they need grounding, and the stone house still gives that. Samuel Mercer, though not born a Mercer, was won by bond stronger than blood. As Josephine's adopted son, though no papers ever said so, he became what she never asked for, but always prepared, a keeper of the stone, a guardian of the knowledge no school taught and no preacher dared claim from the pulpit. The year after her death, he rebuilt the back half of the cabin, not because it needed it, but because he wanted to add a second stove for the growing families that still came every winter when someone's roof leaked or someone's baby was born early and the wind was too cruel for the soft pine homes below. And when he rebuilt that section, he did it the way she had, rock by rock, ash in the mortar, pitch-sealed seams, slope angled into the earth like he was laying down roots instead of walls. That year, the snows returned heavy again, the worst in a decade, and once again, the town gathered in her home. Some came carrying their children, others came with tools and hands to help. No one knocked anymore. They just knew. One family brought her name carved into a cedar plank, Josephine Mercer House, foundation first. It wasn't a shrine, not a church, just the truth, written plain. The name stuck. In time, the house became more than shelter. It became teaching. The front room was cleared and fitted with long benches. Samuel opened it every Saturday at noon and let anyone who wished come learn what Josephine had taught him. How to read a slope, how to build on stone, how to check for frost heave, where to place a chimney to draw heat instead of waste it. They came hungry for that knowledge, not just townsfolk, builders from the next county, railroad men, young couples from the ridge, women with rolled blueprints and calloused fingers, men men who knew how to swing a hammer, but not how to make a home that outlived them. Samuel showed them what she'd shown him. And before each lesson, he said the same thing. She wasn't trying to build a house. She was trying to build a memory no storm could erase. He never claimed credit, never put his name to anything. But slowly, the town began to reflect what Josephine had made them become. Every public building now had stone at its base. The new town hall, finished years after she passed, bore a plaque that read, "Built upon rock as taught by Mercer." And beneath that, in memory of the widow who stayed standing. As for the cabin, it changed with time, but never lost its shape. The main hearth was kept alive through every winter. The original stones, blackened and warm, were never moved. Children slept there still, some as temporary guests, others born into a family legacy that no longer began with bloodlines, but with stories passed down. Some of the town's oldest would sit by the fire and murmur. She carried those rocks herself, up from the ravine. They laughed, but they came running when their floors cracked. She saved my cousin that winter, fed her with broth, and never asked a thing in return. It wasn't folklore, not quite. There were records, ledgers, accounts of births and deaths, and that terrible storm, the winter she saved half the town. But the stories were what survived, what mattered. One year, a teacher from a far city came through Deadwood Hollow. She asked the mayor where the oldest building in town stood. He brought her to the bluff. "It's a museum now?" she asked, seeing the sign. "No," he said. "It's a house, but it belongs to all of us." Inside, she found a woman baking bread in the same hearth Josephine had stoked with trembling fingers. Children read by the light of oil lamps. A dog slept on the old stone floor. The walls were full of framed drawings, some in charcoal, some in ink, some just etched on scraps of wood, all of homes with thick walls and deep roots. The teacher stayed 3 nights longer than planned. When she returned to her city, she told her class, "I saw a house that outlived its builder, not because it was strong, but because the builder taught others how to do the same." Samuel passed 10 years after Josephine. Old age, in his sleep, peaceful. They buried him beside her. Not beneath the cabin like she was, but at its edge, under the same rock bluff where she'd hauled her first stone. They didn't build a fence, just 2 carved stones. Hers said nothing but her name. His had one phrase beneath, "She showed me how to stand." The town still honors them every year. On the anniversary of the storm, the one that broke every house but hers, they gather at dusk. They bring food. They light a small fire on the hearth and tell stories, not just about her, about their own storms, their own rebuildings, their own lessons passed on. Children lay hands on the stones and say, "This is the house that stayed up." And parents answer, "Because the woman who built it knew what was coming." No one laughs anymore when someone chooses stone over speed. No one mocks a widow with calloused hands. And every house in Deadwood Hollow, every last one, has a foundation set deep, sealed in ash and mortar, kissed by the memory of the woman who taught them all that lasting wasn't luck. It was choice, it was work, it was stone. And her name is written in every beam that doesn't bend, in every floor that doesn't freeze, in every wall that holds fast when the wind howls. Josephine Mercer didn't just build a cabin, she built a town that learned how to survive. And she did it with nothing but grief in her chest, frost on her breath, and stone under her feet.